This project was only possible given the freedom provided by Gallatin's curriculum and pedagogical philosophy. We were left on our own schedules and to our own devices. This agency allowed us to create the project of our dreams, and I do not think it would have been possible were it constrained by more formal guidelines. With this in mind, I'd now like to welcome our education panelists, Carol Gilligan, Devanshi Garg, as well as the Steinhardt Department Chairs Catherine Milne and James Fraser to join us for a conversation around the value of empowering students as individuals and giving them agency in their learning. Unfortunately, Diane Ravitch will not be joining us due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, but she sends her best to our team and to the project. So to keep this as informal and personal as possible, I think we should start. You can give a brief 2-minute introduction, and then a reflection on your personal experience as a student or in your childhood and your professional careers, what the point that motivated you to become an educator or explore the education space. Carol, do you want to begin?
Well, first of all, I'm just agog with looking at this and seeing this amazing design. I mean, I want to go to the school. The openness and just the imagination of it. So thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I would just say one thing, which is what drew me into education was having fabulous teachers. And also having the experience when I was at Swarthmore of a very open educational system, which just, I would just say encouraged a kind of freedom and curiosity, and also encouraged our voices because we did a lot of writing. And then with my research and work, I initially was in the university world, and after listening to women's voices and becoming interested in how bringing women's voices into what was called the human conversation, I then, after I wrote my book in a different voice, got very interested in the fact that no one had been listening to girls. And so I went to pursue girls as narrators of their own basically experiences in coming of age, and working with girls took me into schools, and I spent about many years working in schools. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Jim Fraser. I'm a historian. I feel like we ought to be on a television. This looks like a television
Doesn't
set,
it?
right?
Yeah, it
With
looks
the
like we're on a
camera
talk
up
show.
there. I'm sure we're going to be on some national media very quickly. And I also share the enthusiasm about this school. I wish I could have gone to a school with that kind of openness and commitment to engagement. As a historian, I want to say one word about Carol Gilligan, which is when you talked about listening to, bringing women into the conversation and listening to girls' voices, I think it's easy for us to forget in 2018 that was groundbreaking, that the idea that we might have both genders in the academic conversation about history or anything else was not taken for granted, not that long ago. And so I'm grateful for that. So I think about your question, Josh, and I have a slightly different answer because I know what got me engaged and my own sense of agency in my education, and I'm dating myself. It was Columbia 1968. And the events on that campus that year, that incredible year of turmoil and of student protest. It was a protest about the gymnasium being built in the Morningside Park, but it was anti-war, it was dealing with American racism. And suddenly for me, what I had been doing up until then, and I was already a graduate student at that point, was sort of taking courses and doing what I was expected to do. And I was pretty good at it, but I was bored to death. And suddenly there was a reason for all of this, and a reason for me to take charge, and a reason for me to push back, and a reason for me to get much more involved in shaping my own education. It sort of moved me from being the most kind of traditional student to, it didn't exist then, but wishing I'd been a Gallatin student where I could shape things for myself. So there's a moment I can date for that. And I have spent much of my career since then as a historian also working with high school students, being very, our former colleague Pedro Noguera always said that when he surveys high school students, they say history's my most boring subject. You know, as a historian, that breaks my heart. And so I have spent much of my career, you know, writing the kind of traditional monographs in history that people write, but also thinking about how do I make history come alive for high school students today? How can history be a vehicle to foster the sense of agency that what happened to me in the protests of the late 1960s fostered for me personally? So I will talk a lot more about that as we have time, but that issue of agency, because without student agency, some students do okay, others just drop out, but the idea that a bored student can learn something because I'm going to give a great lecture is nonsense, right? Students learn when they get excited and want to learn. And unless we can create a sense of excitement and agency, we're doomed as teachers, historians or any other kind, even scientists.
Hi, my name is Catherine Milne. I'm in the Department of Teaching and Learning, and it was my pleasure this semester to have Josh in a course that I taught with another colleague, Carolyn Strom, who couldn't be here today, called Creativity Unbound. And part of the impetus for that course was based on the fact that how we construct the notion of creativity can be, in some ways, very narrow. And so we wanted to broaden the conversation around the nature of creativity. And in a way, my pathway to that course is mirrored in my educational pathway or trajectory, life, because when I started school, unlike, I don't know how many of you have ever been to a one-teacher school. How many of you have ever been to a two-teacher school? I've been to both. I started grade 1 in a two-teacher school, and then in grade 2 I went to a one-teacher school. So, and then of course I went to a very big elementary school, and the rest is history. I never actually, through high school, even thought that I would become an educator. My original goal was to become a scientist. I wanted to be a paleontologist. And I'll never forget, I went as an undergraduate, gung-ho, and my advisor said to me, "Why do you want to be a paleontologist? There's no jobs for paleontologists." And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? That's what I was going to do. And so I thought, I'll do another course because I can. And so I chose to do first-year education. And that is what really intrigued me. My experiences with science teachers had been incredibly, mostly negative. And it really got me thinking about the way we teach science. Now, since I've become involved in teaching and learning, I've also thought about the way we teach some of the most vulnerable populations, the very young, and I think we have a responsibility in a department like mine to really challenge the current structures that are not equitable or fair and don't allow people to exercise the agency that they should exercise with respect to their learning. So that's me.
Thanks, Kat.
Hi, my name's Devanshi, and so the reason I'm really interested in education, I'll tell you about my background in a second, is I grew up studying all around the world. So I moved a lot, and I studied in the UK, in India, and then in New Zealand. And it was very interesting growing up and learning in very different environments. And I felt that always gave me a sense of, comparison, a sense of what's good or bad. And it helped me kind of connect the dots between kind of disparate places and disparate worlds and disparate fields. So after university, I studied psychology. I went on to work in management consulting. And after that, I moved back to India to solve what I saw was a huge problem in India, in specifically education in India, which was that the skills that students were being prepared for the skills that students were being taught in schools weren't the skills that needed, that would help them succeed in real life. And so I felt like our schools and our universities weren't preparing young adults, the future of our population, to lead, to innovate, and to succeed, and to live happily, like happy, purpose-driven, to find happy, purpose-driven work. And that was an ed tech startup, and I moved to New York, and I've been doing another tech startup. And although more of an entrepreneur in that space, my role in education is that I continue to kind of coach and mentor about 35 of our team members. And I'm the chief operating officer there. So I guess going back to the subject at hand, I do feel like one of the gaps that I've seen that has always inspired me to change how education is delivered across institutions is that gap between how do we learn what will be useful for us, as students when we go out into the world, and how do we help students do that. I think there's a lot of, I think that's a bigger problem, and I think sometimes the fact that there are a lot of counter forces at hand where there's not enough incentive for people to solve this problem, which is why I think this this conference today is much needed. So.
Great. So one of the centerpieces of our curriculum design has been this block that we call narrative, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in the curriculum presentation after this. But in short, our idea is that we would present a narrative around a cultural or a historic figure or event or trend, and then students would be allowed to pursue sort of independent research on that narrative, and then present their perspective that they've gleaned through that research to the class, and then together, through the plurality of perspectives, build sort of collective knowledge. And I'm wondering if any of you could speak to the importance of gleaning perspectives in a child's education, and how that it helps them prepare for life. Being a democratic citizen, being a good employee in a company. Carol, I was wondering if you could start us off with that.
Sure. No, I wanted to say, after Jim spoke, I thought, because you brought back the 60s, and I was there. But I thought, nobody has said this yet. I mean, when I was at Harvard at the ed school, starting in just the late 60s, early 70s, we all thought, how could you not be in education if you believed in the future? And more than that, we believe that education is the nonviolent means of social change. So, I mean, it is the alternative to violence. It's the alternative to war. And it was amazing at that time because I can't tell you the energy and the ideal. Your project reminds me of this. That was true at Harvard, at the ed school, at that time. And students were turning down arts and sciences. I'm afraid they turned down history. I mean, they turned down the psych department and came to us. It was great. So there was really this sense of, in a certain sense, how could you not be committed to education? And I think that has diminished somewhat. The thing I wanted to say about my own experience of working in schools, it started with girls, as I mentioned, although then I worked with boys, in the 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old boys, at these very crucial times in development when children's resiliency is at heightened risk. And what I found was that the work, by going into schools, and this is going to relate to narrative, I have that in my mind, Josh, that going into schools, and we were researchers, and we went in to learn from girls, so we were in to listen to girls' voices and then to listen to the voices of young boys. And it had a profound effect on the teachers, to listen to the voices of the children. And in a sense, it woke up for the adults in the school voices within themselves that they had forgotten or held in silence. And it seems to me that one of the challenges for schools is how do you educate, I would put it, the human voice, because we're all born with a voice. And not only that, we're born with a voice, with the ability to give expression to what's going on within ourselves, to our feelings and our experience. I mean, even before language, if you think of a baby, I mean, a baby expresses how the baby is feeling. Yeah. And the baby engages with the people who are involved taking care of the baby and desires to be in responsive relationship. And it seems to me that the big challenge for education is, first of all, how do you encourage, how do you educate, how do you develop this basic human capacity, which is at the root of mutual understanding, which is so key to our world today. So I think the thing about narrative is it's in a way the emphasis now on STEM subjects and quantitative work, which is just fine, but there needs to be an equal emphasis on narrative, because in a certain way, I mean, as mathematics is to understanding the physical world, narrative is how we understand the human world. I mean, we know ourselves through stories. So the questions about narrative, I mean, this is certainly at the center of my work, which is, you know, to listen, who's speaking and to whom? These are basic narrative questions. And in what physical context or place? I mean, the voice is very physical. And telling what stories about which relationships? I mean, what are the narratives that children are encouraged? First of all, what are the narratives that they're exposed to, and what are the narratives that they themselves are carrying with them? And then in what societal and cultural frameworks? And so if you start with narrative, you bring in really the most basic human questions. And it seems to me just at the core of anything you're doing in education right now. So
that's a fantastic answer. Jim, in particular reference to your research on teaching history, this is one of our blocks that we would say is the way that we would teach these historical narratives. So I'm wondering if you could say something about that.
So sure, a couple of big picture things, and then I'll get to history. So one is that the question is who's teaching and to whom, but also who's being silenced and by whom. And you know, I think Kath and I are both teacher educators, spend most of our time being teacher educators, and there's a issue, a tragedy in teacher education in a certain sense that when you say those teachers were blown away by listening to their students,
the way it led them to listen to themselves, and then to start to make changes in their teaching and classroom, which brought them up against the surrounding forces that are invested in a certain sense in maintaining the status quo. That's
yeah, no, I think that, and I think if we can flip that conversation so that we start the enterprise of teaching by more listening and less talking, I think we get somewhere. And that brings me to history again, which is my passion, and which I worry about, and which I feel, even though you were robbing historians for the ed school, of all the disciplines, it is a discipline in which the conversation about the social good and the good society and what we bring from the past that will help us shape the future ought to be taking place. You know, and when we turn history, as it happens in the hands of bad teachers, into memorize these names and these dates, and then everybody gets bored with the process. You know, that's not what we're doing. It's the vehicle for me, and what excites me about it is to have it be the vehicle to turn the conversation around and start looking at predecessors who will talk to us about the way this conversation has gone on for millennia. I guess I have a word about the narrative, which is be cautious, because I think the danger for all of us who are historians and who are excited about our subject is to become drones, to end up talking a lot and talking too much and listening too little. And I think that's probably true in every discipline. Sounds like you're dealing with some of that in the sciences, but certainly in history, that's a great danger. And so I get worried about the narrative first rather than a bit later in the conversation. My colleague Walter Parker, who teaches at the University of Washington, says, beware of background information. All of us as historians want to teach a class by starting with, well, let me explain the context, and after I've explained what's going on here and what the context is, then we'll get to some group work, or then we'll get to project-based learning, which is something that I really value and can talk more about if we get time for that. Rather than saying, let's, as a class, take on a project such as designing a school, or designing a good society, or making education transformative, and then, or something much smaller. How do we envision what went on in the first century after the Columbian encounter, when cultures that knew nothing about each other, Native Americans, Europeans, Africans, came together and created new culture in the Latino community and engaged with each other, not as equals, but in transformative ways. Whatever those projects are, starting with the project, starting with the student work, and then moving to the narrative, where at a certain point it is the teacher's responsibility to guide the project, to make sure that it moves somewhere, that it's not just, oh, we're sure having a lot of fun preparing this play on X, Y, or Z, but that we're trying to move somewhere and accomplish certain kinds of knowledge. But I think the order of things, if we want to create student voice and student energy, we have to start with student voice and student energy, and then bring the narrative in along the way. I was taken outside with the little blurb on Paideia, which I really loved, and in the quick summary was, as I was reading it, was Paideia means education, but it means education for the intellect and education for the good society. And I think that notion of that kind of dialogue transforms the way we approach history and probably other disciplines.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, as we were designing the narrative block, that we wanted to put an emphasis on was that teaching through stories is not a new concept in educational curriculum and education curriculum design and pedagogy. But our focus was transforming it so that the narratives that were taught didn't have a prescriptive goal in mind that was predefined, that students were supposed to progress through the narrative and then learn or attain at the end. Rather, that there were narratives that are important to learn because historical narratives are important to learn, and that the student's voice comes out in the perspective that they choose to explore in the narrative. And I think with any narrative, there are a million different ways to look at it, and those narratives in combination is what's important to focus on.
I completely agree with that. And again, it's the order of things, because it's so easy for us as the person in charge to, without even thinking about it, silence the students, as opposed to starting with voice. But there is a role for narrative. There are stories that matter, and I worry about a society that has as little historical memory as 21st century United States has. I think it can be a breeding ground for all sorts of tyranny if we don't know the history of the Civil Rights Movement, if we don't know the history of the American Revolution, if we don't know the history of emancipation and Reconstruction. We don't know that history at our peril. But if I say, I'm going to teach you about the American Revolution because it's good for you, the chances of students learning very much from us, or getting engaged, or thinking, gee, I could be a revolutionary, is pretty slim.
Absolutely. Kath and Devanshi, this question is geared towards you. So Kath, I was in your class this semester, Creativity Unbound, which we talked about, and one of the things that I really loved about the class was that you placed an emphasis on generating physical objects, creating things that were just around the classroom, LED bulbs and batteries and clay, everything was at our disposal. And I think you and Carolyn did a really good job of weaving it into the curriculum and teaching us about creativity. One of the things that I loved was we were assigned a TED Talk to watch on embracing the shake, is called, and the TED talker talks about him being an artist and developing a shake from doing pointillism. And instead of sort of trying to fight through it and continue his pointillism art, he decided to embrace the shake and explore other ways of creating art, not just painting. So he combined Starbucks cups and sketched on all of them, and together they created a composition. And sort of the framework of embracing limitation and that creativity can live within that framework, I think was a really powerful idea. And Devanshi, I know that you've worked in, have experience in India creating entrepreneurial after-school programs. So I'm wondering what you think the connection is between creativity and being generative and developing those entrepreneurial skills. And then Kath, if you could comment on that as well.
Sure. So I noticed some very interesting things when I was working with high school students and early college students in India. So we talk about the narrative. We have this kind of dominant narrative of society as well, and so I used to teach this exercise in New Zealand when I was a tutor there. And it was basically, it's a pretty, some of you may have done this creative exercise before. Basically, you want to throw an egg from varying heights, and you have to make sure it doesn't break. And you have to build contraptions. You could build, parachutes. And so you have your students working in teams, trying to make sure this egg doesn't break, and you have all sorts of material to help them. And it was so interesting because when we did this with our students in India, their first instinct was to run for like bubble wrap. And it was like, who's gonna bubble wrap their egg more, right? And they were like rushing for more bubble wrap, fighting each other for more bubble wrap. And it was very interesting because I did this with a teaching assistant that worked with me in New Zealand, and we taught this where people were a lot more creative in New Zealand. And we were wondering why, and it was because the dominant narrative is a narrative of scarcity, of scarcity of resources, and and of intensive pressure and competitiveness. So for them it was all about like who gets more resource instead of how can I do something with something that wouldn't look like something that's a really important raw material here, or what can I do with something that doesn't jump out at me as something that I could use here. So it was really interesting to notice that and then to turn that around. And when students saw themselves doing that, and again, it's so interesting to develop self-awareness in students, because I think that's another skill that is so helpful in so many layers of life, in relationships, in your career growth and career trajectory, in building your management skills. But that self-awareness is missing. And so there's a layer of kind of, maybe journalism exercises or just introspection or reflection or, journal writing. It's just, those are skills that they when they noticed themselves, they all kind of sat down and laughed, and they're like, oh, true, we don't all need bubble wrap. And then I just removed the bubble wrap, and, they had stones and sticks and cloth and shoelaces, and we're like, now let's figure it out. And it just created an environment for them to, think differently and realize, what they were doing.
So I suppose what I'll do with your question, Josh, is take the opportunity to say that I think part of education also needs to look at the material world in which we live. So, I take Karen Barad's point very seriously when she talks about meeting the universe halfway. And so part of what I try to do is to create environments, learning environments, where people have to work with the environment in some way. My experience has been, I think narrative is absolutely essential, but I don't think it's an either-or question, because my experience with young people in particular is that in some ways the virtual world has become almost more real than the experienced world. That concerns me somewhat because we are making decisions about the only planet we can live on right now without really engaging with the planet in particular ways. And I think actually, so I've tried to focus a lot of my classes on encouraging young people to listen to the matter that surrounds them without ignoring the virtual world that's so important to our existence these days. And so, and as I think about this, and as I said in class, to listen to matter, to not try and force, a bit like human beings, right? So rather than trying to force other humans to do what we want to do, to not try to not get angry if the matter doesn't quite behave the way we think it should, but to listen to what the matter is trying to tell us. So for me, and when we do that in classrooms, I think what we find is if we give space for matter, we actually also give space for young people to interact with material in ways that then remove the teacher as I think teachers are absolutely essential, but they are not the only way they are not the only conduit for how we can come to understand the world. I think part of a teacher's role is to ask good questions about things that young people haven't thought of before, and to provide opportunities for learning that have young people working together on various things. So I think history is essential in science too. If we don't have history, if we don't have a history, kids don't understand that all our knowledge is constructed, both whatever discipline it happens to be. Without history, often science, which is my area obviously, is presented as though it's already been constructed and kids are supposed to learn it. So I think history is essential. I think matter needs to be central, and stories are very important.
Can I ask a question, Josh? So I'm glad you think history is important. Can you give an example of listening to matter? Because I'm fascinated.
Okay, so if I can give it the example from our class. So one of the activities that I had the students, one of the activities the students in the class did was they made conducting an insulating dough, and then they were asked to make something creative, but the conducting an insulating dough in a circuit so that LEDs would light up. We had various things going on. And of course, people make their insulating and conducting dough, and then they can't get their circuit to work. This is very frustrating. And I said to them, listen, the matter is trying to tell you something. What is the matter trying to tell you about your circuit? You have to listen to the matter. Give yourself time, because a lot of the people we work with, outcomes become a de facto measure of knowledge and learning. So I've got to get these outcomes. This is my goal. I've got to achieve these goals. Rather than just giving yourself time to experience the world in which you live. So that's what I mean by matter.
Thank you. I promised at least 20 minutes for Q&A, but I just wanted to follow that up with a short reflection. One of the interesting things about this project was we were working with software that was not very easy to use. Software tends to crash a lot, especially when you're working on laptops and you don't have Michael's shaking his head because a few days ago we were up until like 5 in the morning trying to render the classrooms. It takes 30 minutes to do a render, and then it finally finishes and you realize the light is a little bit off, or you realize that the chair isn't really where it should be, and you have to start all over, and it takes another 30 minutes. And once you add a significant amount of components into your models, it starts getting really difficult to even pan around the model. So you can't even zoom in and get the frame right. But one of the things that I tried to remind our team is that trust is really important when you're working with material software. I think there's similarities between them. And you have to sort of work through that impasse that you face. and that's the only way that you can progress through. You can't just get frustrated and throw it out. It's often just a little patience and a little, embracing the impasse that really gets you through. But I also wanted to ask Carol, since you do so much of your work is based around listening to people, I'm wondering if you could respond to this emphasis on listening to material, and if you see if there are any parallels between the two.
Only that listening to you struck me. It's equally hard to get people to listen to people.
Yes.
I imagine that's true. I have plenty of other questions I can ask our panelists, but I wanted to open it up to see if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. No?
I thought I would expect this. I'm mesmerized by you. I have to tell you why.
Sure.
I was born in Dunkirk, New York, and it was a very, very primitive area, very poor. And I went to school, and I had a visual problem. And so, I had to wear glasses as thick as you could possibly see. And in that little town, they started a sight-saving class. They listened to the children. I had one teacher for 6 years, and everything was geared to sight-saving. All the letters were larger, the books were larger. Whatever we did was so that we didn't have to punish our eyes in trying to maintain a good level in a classroom. And I thank Miss Gainey till today for listening to what we had to do. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for your sharing. My name is Adam from Stone Business School. I'm exchanging MBA student here. My home college is Peking University from China. I was an educator in China before I was enrolled in MBA program. So in China, we have maybe similar issue to encourage like young talent to be a educator. So even when I was visiting Washington D.C. On the bus or in the subway, I also saw some recruitment notice to ask for young talents to be a teacher in the U.S. Some even specifically asking for STEM teachers for recruitment. So I'm wondering, how would you like to encourage like a young American or like global-wide, like young talent to be a teacher, to contribute to the non-violence social change? Because yes,
Yeah, you're right.
just 2 days ago, the board chair of Alibaba Group went back to his home college to celebrate the 110th anniversary. So Jack Ma said, if all the most talented, young talented go to finance, go to software, who will contribute to our education? This could be a national-wide issue. So how would you comment on that? Thank you.
Well, no, it's a terrific question. First of all, I mean, when I grew up in New York City, most of my friends' mothers were teachers. And they were, they were outstanding women. And they taught, I think they felt a sense of huge mission about teaching children and the next education, so forth. And I think there's been something of a crisis in our society because, in a certain sense, teaching was one of the few things women could do in those times. And teachers, as you know from the teacher strikes right now, the conditions for teachers are terrible. I mean, which is why they end up at Stern Business School. I mean, it doesn't take a wizard to figure it out, in a certain way. So I think you have to start with valuing education. I was thinking, looking at Josh and the group school, that would be a huge enticement to a teacher to come and work in such a school. The other thing I want to say is that when I was doing this work with girls and the teachers wanted to get involved, many of the teachers were, we started with the teachers by asking the question that your question really implies, which is, what was the passion that led you into teaching? And it was so interesting because it was a passion. I mean, for whether it was for history or for science or for children or something like that. And the other thing that struck me as I worked in schools and I saw what happened when teachers really connected with their passions and started to teach from that. You know, to say that education is the nonviolent means of social change, which it is, and to say that as humans we start out with a huge capacity, both with a voice, as I said, and with the potential for engaging with other, and the desire to engage with other people. And in a sense, I mean, education is very revolutionary. And so I think that a lot of people are afraid of education. And there's a lot of attempt to control education precisely because when you unleash people's curiosity, I mean, in my class, we have an exercise called asking a real question. And I spend a lot of time, what I think of as undoing the effects of what's called education, where people learn to ask good questions or important questions, but not to connect with their own curiosity. So, I mean, you know, countries like Finland, who value their teachers, you know, it's so interesting. Do you know why they don't give tests in Finland? You know, it has the highest level of achievement in education, in maths and in everything. They're just at the top of all the things. The reason they don't test the students is they feel that's insulting to the teachers. In other words, if you trust the teacher, you don't come in and bypass the teacher and test the student. I mean, it's up to the teacher to figure out how the teacher can assess what the students are learning and needs to learn. So very basic things, which as a Chinese person, you would understand very deeply. What about respect for teachers? And respect for teachers' voice and agency in the classroom. And I think is that a lot of that started to happen in the 60s and 70s. I mean, I remember all of the people who were drawn into education. And I think maybe people, I think there was a reaction against exactly that sense of the potential of where you could go with real education. So.
Your question also reminds me, over the summer I went on a graduate study abroad program and did field research on standardized testing in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and Taipei and Beijing. I'm sure we could have a very interesting conversation. But one of the things that I was so shocked by is specifically in Hong Kong, I remember interviewing a vice principal, and their curriculum, they have 3 years of high school, and their curriculum is entirely tailored around the DSE exam. The equivalent to the SAT in the US, and it's called the Gaokao exam in mainland China. And so the students really spend 3 years memorizing for this one exam, because there's the massive population, and there have to be graders, and there has to be criteria for the graders to judge the papers that the students write. And so there's really a limited amount of responses that students memorize and then are expected to regurgitate to ace the test to go on to university. And if you don't go to university, you know, it's very unlikely that you'll get the job that you want. And China has a history of valuing standardized testing as this peak achievement. And so, but the problem was that because there are only 8 universities in Hong Kong, 85% of the students who take the DSE exam don't pass with high enough grades to get into one of these 8 universities. And so for 3 years, students prepare for this exam that they are going to fail. Not only does this, not to mention the ways that this limits teachers bringing their passion into the classroom because they're forced to tailor to the test. We don't have Diane Ravitch here, but I'm sure she could talk volumes on this topic. But it also, in terms of raising entrepreneurs and people who feel a sense of independence and confidence, self-confidence is really important to cultivate these entrepreneurial skills. When you dedicate 3 years of your life to something that you will likely fail, it is just crushing. And not only does it not inspire you to go out and change the world, but it's really hard to even get out of bed in the morning. And these students are living in very tiny houses in Hong Kong, studying until 2 a.m. in the morning. There's like 15-year-olds, and they wake up at 7 a.m. and their classes go until July. I went to visit these places in July, and they're still in school with extra classes preparing for this exam. So I do want to say that standardized testing is truly, I believe, the antithesis of an education for the future. And I think collectively we need to find other ways of keeping track of students' progress and place more of an emphasis on growth.
Two quick comments, if I may. So one is, I was at New Trier High School in Winnetka, Illinois, which is considered one of the 10 best high schools in the United States. It gets all these rave reviews. Of course, it's also a very prosperous community with very highly paid teachers and all of that. And I said, how do you deal with the Illinois state standardized tests? And they said, we ignore them. We make the curriculum interesting. We spend a lot of time trying to get students engaged in foster agency. And by the way, all our students do fine on the tests. So they, I think there is that notion, if we drill and kill and getting kids bored does not get kids higher test scores, as opposed to making the curriculum interesting. I was thinking as you were talking, Robert Fried wrote this lovely book called The Passionate Teacher. And I think it's really true. And he basically says, if you aren't passionate about something, kids or history or science, don't go into teaching. It's a career for teaching. The last thing I just want to say, there is some pretty major research on why teachers leave teaching. And there are basically 3 prime reasons. There's lots of other reasons, but 3 prime reasons. One is life circumstances change and they move and they can't get a job. One is they don't feel appreciated by the principal, by the school structure, and they feel bogged down by the bureaucratic demands which are growing every day. And fill out these forms, do all of this work. By the end of the day, you don't feel like very passionate or creative about anything because you're exhausted. And the third is plain old salary. I mean, we are not going to transform this country until we dramatically transform the salary structure of the teaching profession. And that's one place where Finland is hugely different.
Yeah, I was just about to say their salaries are over 6 figures, and I think it goes a long way into empowering teachers.
Oh, yeah. Everybody wants to get into to education school. Yeah.
Its schools have a higher rejection rate than med schools in Finland.
Yeah, right. I mean, the thing is that, I would say, teaching it's so engaging. It's such a wonderful thing to do. And so that if you paid people, if you respected it, if you valued it, if you made it possible for people to have the kind of, to engage their passion, I think you'd have lots of people going into teaching. But who can live on $40,000 a year? I mean, Yes.
We have time for one last question. Okay, maybe 2. Okay, two very brief questions. Sure.
Thank you. As a public school teacher, and I have to tell you that the passion and the creativity is being stifled by the system itself.
Yeah,
Everything is test-oriented, this and that, teaching for the test. And the teachers leave within 5 years because they can't do what they want. They can't even put their arms around a kid because the kid knows more about his or her rights than the teacher. I'm going to bring my parent in if you don't do what I tell you to. The whole system has changed, and we need a revolution in education in general. And my union is so status quo. It's like incredible, the UFT. I'm sorry. there's still hope, but it's got to be a revamp of the whole system.
We're working on it. Last question.
The notion of nonviolent change in education. Is there something wrong with violent change in education? I'm just going to throw that out there because, I mean, we're living in a country that's based on a very violent form of change. But the second thing is, what do we mean by violent? Because wouldn't you argue that, wouldn't your teachers in Finland argue that the testing that would be imposed on them or would otherwise be imposed could in itself be a form of violence to them? I mean, really, how do you want to define the violence?
Yep. That's right.
I was being very literal. I meant by physical force. I mean, like Revolutionary War in this country and so forth. And I am, like Jim, someone who was very influenced by the 60s and by Martin Luther King and militant nonviolence and the force of truth and the idea that you can bring about change, because the problem with violence is that it invites violence. And it's very hard to end the cycle. I mean, there's a beautiful example from Piaget, who has a little boy who says, you know, the only end to revenge is revenge. And so how do you break that kind of cycle? The thing about education is it starts with so much hope, because it always starts with the new, with the child. And so there's so much potential and there's so much hope. And so if you have a vision of where you want to go, I mean, a lot of my work zeroed in on those moments where a child's really capacity to have a voice and to give voice to their thoughts and their feelings and experiences. I mean, that's what we educate. And to be present in their relationship is really at risk, where they're offered a deal, which is basically, if you silence yourself, we'll give you high grades and so forth and so on, because they don't, you know, each generation comes and can bring new perspectives in. So that's played out in schools in the classroom, and how teachers respond, and whether the school invites this and whether the school supports that kind of thing. It's a potential. So when you talk, that's not violent social change. That's meaning taking a potential. It's like growing your own, you know, vertical garden. It's seeing the potential to do something new and doing it, to realize your goal of. I appreciate you're saying this is the only planet we have to live on, and yet we're being, you know, we have our heads in the sand about what we're doing. So that's.
Yeah, and I would also just add to that, you know, education for the future, I think that violence is truly just barbaric. And it's in the 21st century, it is unproductive to encourage violence. The countries do not use war to gain an advantage anymore. I think the focus is on trade and cooperation, and there are thousands of nuclear weapons. Thankfully, our president has not pushed the button yet. But I think that the trend is towards nonviolent cooperation, and that's truly the future. Yes.
Said that was the last
Last question. Sure.
I want to know, where is higher ed in all of this? We're not partnering with our elementary, middle, high schools and saying we're receiving these kids who are being tested beyond belief, and they can't think when they come here. And we don't want, you know, we want kids who are creative. We want young people who are thinking, and look at what you're doing. And I just think that this is an indictment on higher ed. We're not doing our jobs by partnering, getting out there and saying, and I know that I'm starting a revolution at the Untitled. Oh, bravo.
Sure, absolutely.
This is something that is
Great. Love it.
And we feel the same thing as employers, you know, when we're hiring people, because those same children become students, then they become employees. And again, you can't, you know, they need so much more hand-holding, they need so much more structure. They're not good at handling ambiguity. They're not good at leadership. They're not good at little things like, oh, did you get this done? Oh, no, I sent the email. So, well, but is it done? Like, so what? If it's the littlest things. It's, you know, they don't know how to think creatively. They just can't own a project, take it to the end. They don't know how to work with people. They don't know how to work together as a team, to hear each other, work with each other, play to each other's strengths, handle workplace conflict. Yeah, it's tough.
And I asked Josh if I could say something about this, because I worked in a school, taught in a school, where students did a lot of things in the school. I think I was shocked when I came to the United States and went to a school where the principal closed the doors after 8:20 and locked out the kids who were late to school. I just couldn't. And she gave the announcements over the PA. I'm saying, where are the students involved in the running of this school? So as far as I'm concerned, one of the things that Josh's proposal, which I think is the most powerful thing, is that if you want schools to make a difference, everybody has to be involved in that difference making. The students, the school I was at, we offered the curriculum. The student choice determined the structure of the curriculum. The students ran the assemblies. The students, so the students, the youth of the school must be involved in the running of, in all aspects of the school to some degree or other. That's what I think.
Thank you guys so much. So we're now going to transition into our last presentation of the evening, and then we're going to go into expo presentation, and this will be the curriculum presentation. Everyone could take their seats.